Post-capitalist utopia. What do? Stay tuned for my hyper-sectarian pitch. Just kidding. I'm here today to talk about strategies for post-capitalism and just specifically things that I think are missing from the discourse, or just ways that I've started to think about how change will occur and how I am going to be orienting myself towards that change in the coming several decades here in the place where I reside. In case you weren't aware, our Earth is warming at an unprecedented rate, and we have about 10 years, probably a lot less than 10 years, to turn this thing around. I do not doubt that the mere toppling of capitalism, whatever that looks like, will have immense benefit for our environment. But very frankly, I don't think that a lot of organizations and leftist groups are thinking enough about what it would really mean, what it would take, and what it would look like to create a sustainable future at this point, especially in the West. This idea of a luxury gay space communism that just allows people to keep consuming, or just basically allows the status quo, life as we know it now, to continue, energy consumption as we know it now, to continue in the West, is a bit of a pipe dream. Even if we move to 100% renewable energy, digging up all the rare earth minerals, getting all the cobalt from the Congo, etc., that we need to fuel the life that we're living now, I mean, it would still involve colonial theft, or just the West continuing to use a wildly disproportionate amount of the Earth's resources. And sure, I'm sure that a lot of people don't actually think that we can have luxury communism, and that's not actually the goal for most people. But even ideas of the future that are premised upon recreating some kind of industrial socialism, when we have 10 years to turn around climate change, I think are similarly out to lunch. And I am not suggesting that we need to throw away technology and go back to Anne Prim or anything like that, but the reality that I see is that whatever future society we're going to build is going to depend entirely on how much renewable energy, and truly renewable energy, we can produce without taking more than our share of the Earth's resources. And following Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, everyone please read this book. I've been encouraging everyone I know to read this book. Please read this book. But following her, I would like to bring the idea of reciprocity back into discussions of sustainability, because the environmental crisis is essentially a crisis in the relationship. It's a crisis in human-environment relationships, and we need to develop a genuine relationship with our environments that will be reciprocal and thus sustainable. And here I want to talk a bit about worldview, and specifically the problematic Western worldview that separates humans and nature, and sees humans as outside of nature, outside of the ecosystem, outside of the universe. As many political ecologists argue, the externalization of nature, or assuming or viewing nature as external to us or to our society, is the first step in allowing for its commodification. Because if something is external to you, if it is out there, if it is quantifiable, you can commodify it, you can sell it for a price. This lack of understanding of relationship and being a part of the non-human world is also behind colonial mindsets and manifest destiny. And I think that a lot of the way that we are framing revolution and this post-capitalist society is still very European in that sense. It's still very based on this dichotomy between humans and nature, and viewing nature as outside. And what Robin Wall Kimmerer explains in her book is that in order to truly be sustainable, we actually have to learn to become indigenous to place, what she calls it. And that means actually getting to know how we fit within the ecosystems around us. In a globalized world, it's really easy to forget that we are animals and that we also come from a place, that we are actually all rooted in a place. I live in Toronto, for example, and I have just about no relationship with the environments around me. I live in my house, my built-up house, made of all these materials that block the elements out, that block the environment out, and then I use energy to pump in electricity and air, etc., to make the temperature right and to make the light right, because I've blocked out the light, I've blocked out the rest of the ecosystem, and I just go to the store and I buy things that have been mined or grown, etc., halfway around the planet, and then I throw my trash out and I put it out on the curb and people take it away and I never see it again. And so I actually really have no relationship with the environment around me other than one of just using up resources and energy and throwing away trash. This is not a reciprocal relationship in any sense of the word. I am completely disconnected. And I think that it's possible, and I think that a lot of leftists are actually envisioning a future where society looks a little bit the same, right? We've just democratized production, but the core of our society is still production and distribution. When it comes to, the meaning of life, we have all these preoccupations with humans. What is the meaning of our lives, right? But you would never actually ask, what is the meaning of life for a turtle or a coyote or whatever it is, right? The meaning or the purpose of their life is just to exist in their ecosystem and play whatever role they're supposed to be playing within their ecosystem. And sorry to break it to you, but that's humans too, right? We actually have co-evolved with many other species, and our only role, or the only thing that the Earth is asking us to do, is to exist within our ecosystem and play a positive role in that ecosystem. That's it. I'm not saying that's all we should be doing and that we shouldn't bother to do anything else. I'm not saying that at all. All I'm trying to say is that everything that we are doing, our laws and our money and all of the stuff that we've built up on top of that, is superfluous and are things that we are choosing to do. And so recognizing that, we need to make sure that what we are choosing to do in the future, in this future beautiful utopia, is actually giving back positively, is actually making a positive contribution to the environment around us. And I don't think that's built into a lot of people's thinking as much as just, how are we going to produce and, I don't know, still have a modern, cool, fun society. So recentering reciprocity, to me, I mean, that could look many different ways. It could manifest in many different ways. I'm going to talk a bit later about decolonizing revolution, but I think that as settlers who came here with a colonialist mentality, even if we personally were born here and we didn't come here with that mentality, we've been colonized with that mentality. I think that we don't actually have I don't have the knowledge. I don't have the knowledge of how to live in reciprocity with the ecosystems around me. I don't have the knowledge of how to use technology and provide for people in ways that are going to be reciprocal and positive for the environment. And so we need to actually have the humility to admit that and actually center and uplift leadership of the people, the indigenous nations of which we inhabit, who actually do have that knowledge. I think that's very, very important. We need to absolutely be building relationships with local indigenous nations and really involving them in the design and the creation of this post-capitalist future that we're building together. But Robin Wall Kimmerer asks, what do we say from a burning house? We're not going to save everything. Sorry, y'all. We're not going to have luxury socialism. Sorry. I think when we think about utopia, a lot of the way that we think and talk about that has also been shaped by capitalist mentalities and kind of growth-based mentalities and consumption mentalities and luxury mentalities, etc. And I think we need to examine that deeply. Secondly, it seems to me that a lot of people are very, very wed to this idea of capital R revolution, where there's this one defining moment where principled people with guns rise up against the bourgeoisie and then line them all up against a wall and liquidate them. And then we will be happy and free forevermore. Again, I'm talking specifically to Ontario, Canada here, so maybe you are somewhere in the world where this sounds feasible to you and this sounds like an effective way to build a utopia. But in Canada, where I am right now, and I would think in any Western country, I see this as being just about as likely. I mean, it depends what time frame we're talking about. I mean, maybe in 50, 100 years, maybe. In Canada, if this were to happen anytime soon, I believe it would be immediately crushed by the US military and other NATO allies. There's just really no scenario where I see, people storming the White House and coming out on top of things. I also just read Yanis Varoufakis, I don't know how to pronounce that, The Weak Suffer What They Must. And it made it abundantly clear to me just how completely intertwined all of our economies and currencies are with, well, specifically, America, the EU, Japan, etc. If one country in this grouping fell, then it would affect the economies and the currencies of all of the other countries in that grouping. And very frankly, they would not let this happen. If they did let it happen, if they were like, fine, do whatever you want, we're going to embargo you, we're going to sanction you, good luck feeding your people over there. Most of the European countries, I don't think would be able to be food secure. Canada potentially would be, especially with climate change moving forward. But as I said, I don't think that us being directly beside the United States, especially having most of the fresh water in the world, I mean, there are already people warning about America annexing Canada in the next several decades because they will be suffering from climate change, drought, lack of water, etc. And hey, we have a lot of empty land space up here and it will all be fertile. So yeah, I don't think I've ever really believed that a capital R revolution would happen here. Call me a third worldist. Maybe it could happen in a place, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot more probability of it happening in a place kind of on the quote unquote margins of global capital where the big players wouldn't really mind as much. I do see more militancy now, especially as the environmental crisis worsens, so perhaps things will get spicy, but pitting hopes for change on a capital R revolution is actually idealist in my opinion and forgets that we actually have to build the new world from the ground up. I think a lot of privileged leftists have a very romantic idea of capital R revolution, but if you actually think about taking up arms and engaging in brutal, violent conflict, watching your friends die, etc., it's actually incredibly horrifying and traumatizing, and that violent act in and of itself is no guarantee that you'll be able to come together and build a lasting, better society afterwards. There's a ton of other stuff that we need to be doing first. And if we look scientifically at other states that had such capital R revolutions and did that in just one country, I mean, the vast majority of them ended up becoming very centralized, very militarized, moving away from the masses and eventually returning to capitalism. Considering this has repeated itself, I see no reason to believe that if the same path were to be taken in Canada right now, that it too would not become highly centralized and highly militarized in order to fight off America and the rest of the world. Now, potentially, if every country in the world had a concurrent capital R revolution, then this would not happen. This would not be the case, but we don't know because we've never seen that. Some might assume, and they do, and some may argue, and they do, that if everywhere, if the entire world were to have these capital R revolutions, then eventually the material conditions would be such that these states would just dissolve themselves. And maybe that's true. That might very well be true. I can see an argument for that. But it also may not be true at all. It might very well be that once highly centralized, the state apparatuses will exist to perpetuate themselves and never dissolve. And the thing is that I don't know, and neither do you. So I think in addition to bringing reciprocity into the discourse here, I am pleading people to bring some humility into the discourse here. Please just admit to yourself that whatever it is that you think is destined to happen, it's your estimation. It's a guess. It's a guess. It might be an educated guess, but, historical materialism can be predictive in a sense. In my field of political ecology, we use political economic analysis, which is usually done in retrospect, to explain why certain crises came to be and why they played out as such. So, for example, we typically see that when neoliberal policies are applied to conservation and development, we see degradation of the environment, increasing inequality between local people or between states, loss of local access to their livelihoods and to their own environments, loss of local agency, etc. So we can predict that if similar policies are going to be applied in another context, then we can expect the same results, right? So that's predictive in that sense. But the immutable science is not predictive if we have not ever yet seen something happen, if we have not actually seen and documented, yes, when XYZ steps are taken, this is the result, and we can expect that result again, right? We have not seen the result. We have not seen a classless, moneyless, stateless society. And so we don't know exactly XYZ steps to take to get there. There are many theories, but can we all just admit that we don't know that these steps will necessarily result in the utopia, the stateless, classless, moneyless utopia that we're dreaming of? Can we admit that, please? And even more than that, why should we assume that XYZ steps that might work in Bhutan or Malaysia are the same XYZ steps that should work in Canada? We don't know that either, and I would think that they would not be the same XYZ steps, frankly. So my plea is to bring in reciprocity into the discourse and bring in humility and wonder into the discourse. We are all making educated guesses. We are all doing the best that we can. We have to be the theorists of today. And it's a lot easier to just look to a blueprint from the past and say, yes, I'm just going to recreate this. That's pretty simple. But to be actually the theorists of today, there's so many intricate parts of the way that our societies work today, and globalization and our commodity chains and our currencies, etc. There are so many things that we need to disentangle here and now, and I don't see many theorists of today stepping forward. I just don't. And while a lot of people will say that it's clear we need a plurality of tactics, it seems like in the same breath they'll be condemning any other approach but their own dogma as idealist or liberal, reactionary, individualist, revisionist, whatever. I've also been listening to a lot of Seriously Wrong's podcast lately, and wow, I love this podcast. Please go listen to all their episodes. Amazing. But they talk a lot about this idea that, means and ends, the means that we take to get there, are very important, right? And as much as possible, every step of the way, we should be making sure that we are building the society that we want to live in, not the society that we want to transition into the society that we want to live in, hopefully one day somehow. We want to be maintaining our values as we're going forward, right? And they talk a lot about this idea of, liquidating the capitalist class and how that is really not compassionate, it's not empathetic, right? It's abandoning any hope of building a society based in restorative justice, and I think wrongly frames the problem as these evil, greedy individuals are preventing us from living well, and so with them dead, we will. This idea, again, I think it's kind of a masculinist framing of the way that we can create social change. It's kind of like, okay, these people wronged us, and what are we gonna do? We're gonna harm them. Here are our enemies. And once we've just smoten, once we've smitten our enemies, then everything will be grand, right? And we're not paying attention enough to the fact that that's not really the way that we heal trauma. That's not actually, harming others is not actually healing what it is inside of us that is harmed and that is traumatized. And that it's very likely that we could win the war, but not win in terms of not actually building a society that we actually want to live in, one that's built on compassion and love, because we're not actually following those steps in the way that we're approaching this capital R revolution. And I see a lot of this stuff like, liquidate everybody, line them up, guillotine means, etc. I see those themselves as kind of power fantasies in themselves, which again, I feel are pretty masculinist. And I'm not saying that we're not going to have to defend ourselves or that it's not going to be violent. I'm not saying that at all, but I'm saying there's a far cry between community defense and the kind of power fantasies that go along with these other conceptions of what is needed. And I think I've grown a lot more conscious of the fact that a lot of the work of revolution is going to be actually internal and based on collective healing. And collective healing requires openness and vulnerability and, deep connections and deep bonds being built between people, and accountability between people and genuine love between people. And this isn't just a war that we can win with our weapons. Like framing it that way, I think is incredibly patriarchal, definitely toxic, and ultimately I think it's very disconnected from what it is that we need to be building. Again, not saying that things will be totally peaceful and things won't get violent and we won't have to defend ourselves, but I hope people understand what I'm saying here and the differences between those two framings. It's the difference between coming at this from a place of deep love for other people and wanting everyone to be taken care of, and coming at this from a place of just wanting revenge or thinking that revenge is justice. It's the difference between the phallic destruction of everything we hate and actually going through the labor pains of actually birthing something healing and compassionate into existence. And in terms of, means and ends, I think there's a tendency on the left also to, hate cops and hate the military, unless it's socialist cops in the socialist military. And I think, I'm not sure. I mean, I guess there's a lot of us who are abolitionists, etc. And how do we work that into the future society that we're building, right? Actually, shout out to one of my comrades on Facebook, made a hilarious post. It was great. Shout out Autumn. They said, oh, well, if it's the people's prison, then I don't have any problem with it. And, I don't actually want to live in a world where a group of people have the monopoly over violence and can punish me if I dissent in that society. That's not what I'm hoping for when I'm thinking about total liberation. So if that's not part of my vision for the future, then I need to make sure that the steps I take to get to that future keep that in mind at all times. And so I think that going back to my Reclaiming Radical Creativity video, I think it's very important that we actually do the work of radically, creatively imagining the future that we actually want and the way we actually want things to be, and then making sure that every step of the way we're building that in a way that isn't replicating the violent shit that we have now. I mean, I think the hardest part of revolution is not like building this critical mass and storming the White House. I think it's actually changing the way that we interact with ourselves and with others and building bonds with other people and building community in ways that we are actually held responsible and accountable to other people. It's hard to be accountable to other people. It's hard to have responsibilities that you have to uphold and practice and be present and committed for, right? That's tough. So this is all to say that, I'm just lately, or what I'm feeling right now, where I'm at, what I'm thinking about is that I've been really orienting my energy towards building and this idea of dual power, etc., and not so much on this idea of this moment of like radical change that's going to happen. I just call me a pessimist. I just really think that what's far more likely in this current historical moment in Canada or the US, etc., is that the ecological crisis will deepen, and the social crisis will deepen with automation, etc. And slowly but surely, capital will not be able to meet the needs of the people. I do think that this will make people more militant, and we'll see more militant strikes and workers seizing the means of production at their workplaces, which is great. And these kinds of seizures will be critical for actually having the resources to build dual power. And I think that we need to be there, like we need to be building parallel institutions to meet the needs of those people. I'm not talking about retreating into the woods and into a commune and forgetting about the rest of the world. I'm talking about very much getting out there and doing whatever that we can to build up whatever we can in the here and now. I definitely still think we need militancy and to get out there and challenge and disrupt the current system every step of the way. So keep doing that, obviously. But the piece I don't see talked about as often is the building and the birthing from the ground up. I feel excited about this, and as Adrienne Marie Brown says, this movement needs to be pleasurable. We need to make this movement as pleasurable as possible so that it is irresistible for other people to join, and so that we want to be here. This is what we want to be doing. This is the world that we want to be building, the one that we want to live in too. So basically, bring in reciprocity and ecological consciousness into our discourse, bring in more feminism, or at least make sure that we don't fall prey to like masculinist patriarchal visions of social change. And lastly, bring in decolonization into our strategy. This is something that I've taken a lot of flack for on the left, which has been frustrating, honestly. And I think it just underscores why I felt the need to make this video. I feel strongly that the idea of a settler revolution on Indigenous land without Indigenous leadership is colonial. And frankly, I've asked some comrades in various organizations in Toronto what they thought about this issue, and I was pretty disappointed with a lot of their responses. A lot of them were just like, oh, well, we'll do our communist thing at the state level, and then they can just have areas, whatever areas they want, right? I was just like, oh, that sounds like reserves. Sounds like the reserve system, just a socialist reserve system. Doesn't sound that great. And then some people, a lot of leftists were actually saying, well, what are you even talking about? They're only 5% of the population, so it would be undemocratic to have Indigenous nations leading anything because there's so few of them here. Well, yeah, they're 5% of the population because we committed a devastating and ongoing genocide that continues to this day. So you're just basically apologizing for colonialism and saying, well, we're here now, so we make the rules because we have the majority. That's a yikes from me. And what does decolonization mean? Does it mean that settlers need to all go back where they came from?
How about no?
And obviously I'm not Indigenous, so don't take my word for it. Please, I've listed a lot of resources in the description box below, or, build relationships with the Indigenous nations in which you inhabit and ask them how they feel about decolonization and what that would look like in their territory. But generally, whenever I talk to my Indigenous colleagues about this, they say, no, it's not about people going back from where they came from. It's that settlers need to learn to live in the nations that they inhabit. They need to learn to follow natural law. They need to follow the constitutions of the places that they actually inhabit. The treaties themselves were sharing treaties. Indigenous people actually initially welcomed Europeans and said, yes, we will share this with you. It wasn't, yes, I'll sign here and you can have control of all of the land, and as long as I can live on this small reserve. No, that wasn't it at all. It wasn't even that, we own the land. It was, we don't own the land. None of us own the land. We are in relationship with this land and with all of creation, and we will share this with you as long as you uphold your responsibilities to the land and live in reciprocity, etc. And then we done fucked it up. And again, we don't have the knowledge. We don't know how to be Indigenous to place. We have our Western mindsets of humans here, nature there, resource production. Nature is resource. Nature is just the input into our system, into our labor system, and we transform nature into whatever we need. That's our mindset. We don't know how to live in reciprocity with the ecosystems around us. And so I think that honestly, any movement that isn't centering building relationships with Indigenous nations, local Indigenous nations, and elevating their leadership and asking what is it that we can do to support your sovereignty, to support decolonization. What would it look like? What would it look like to share this land in a sustainable, reciprocal, nurturing, responsible way? We have fallen way down on our responsibilities to the land and to each other. And I think that part of this does come from our disconnected Western worldview. Anyway, I'm going to be doing a podcast upcoming with a comrade of mine who is part of the Indigenous Anarchist Federation about this idea of decolonizing revolution and what our strategies can look like if we're taking decolonization seriously. So stay tuned for that. And otherwise, I mean, I can just keep talking, but I feel like I've been talking for a while, and those are my thoughts. I'm sure a lot of people are going to be very angry to hear a lot of these thoughts. And I hope that that's not the case. I hope that you can just take it for what it is and understand that what I'm pleading for is just some humility, compassion, and some critical thought about the here and now and how we're going to move forward together realistically. So thanks so much for watching, everyone. Thanks to Tristan from Step Back for editing this video. Thank you so much to my patrons. I appreciate you so much. I could not do any of this without you. Special shout out to Lauren Sakax. If you'd like to support the show, you can become a monthly patron or become a one-time donor via PayPal. Check out my podcast at veganvanguardpodcast.com. Like, share, comment, subscribe, and I will see you in another video.